Are you done with the live, Pallav? Okay. Oh, thank. So, good afternoon and namaskar to everyone. I am Ayush, representing Voices from the Periphery, and it's both a privilege and an honor to extend a warm welcome to you all for today's enlightening lecture on cricket and Indian nationhood in the wake of independence. At this very moment, although you know cricket is in the air, the ICC Champions Trophy is underway. Adding to the excitement of today's discussion, India celebrated a victory yesterday, and today New Zealand takes on South Africa in what promises to be another thrilling contest. With the sport capturing global attention, this could not be more fitting time to delve into its historical and national significance. We are truly privileged to have with us esteemed Professor Souvik Naha, a scholar whose work has profoundly shaped our understanding of imperial and post-colonial histories. Dr. Naha is a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow and previously held the prestigious Marie Curie Actions Fellowship at Durham University. His research indirectly examines colonial and post-colonial histories with a focus on the British Empire, modern South Asia, sport, public health, and the intersections of mass media and advertising and visual culture. An accomplished scholar, he has co edited several influential journal issues, including FIFA World Cup and beyond, sport, culture, media, and governance, global and transitional sport, ambiguous borders, connected domains, ethical connections, and sport governance, moments, metaphors, memories, defining events in the history of soccer and cricket in the 21st century. His widely acclaimed monograph, Cricket, Public Health and Making the Postcolonial Calcutta, offers a compelling exploration of how cricket became a vital space for public discourse and identity formation in post-colonial India. With an unwavering commitment to decolonization and to evolving legacies of empire, Dr. Naha's scholarship bridges historical inquiry with contemporary global debates, making him one of the foremost voices of the study of imperial and post-colonial history. With further ado, let us extend a warm welcome to Professor Souvik Naha. Sir.
Thank you, Ayush. That was really very kind of you. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here and share some of my thoughts regarding one of my future projects. I wouldn't say future, but it's kind of an ongoing project. So I'll basically take you through some of the themes that I have in mind, some of the themes that I have explored so far. And I would love to have your feedback regarding the stuff that I have in mind for my future research. So in short, basically, I'll be presenting a short synopsis of my forthcoming book. And let's see how things have stacked up so far. So when you invited me to talk to students regarding my research, one of the first things that definitely came to my mind was this Champions Trophy. And the negotiations for that was taking place at the time, about like a couple of months ago, when India had steadfastly refused to travel to Pakistan and play any of its matches on Pakistani soil. And that definitely created a big rift in the cricket world, but the ICC was quite proactive in granting India all of its wishes. I mean, even a genie grants you 3 wishes. But if you are India and you have the ICC to support you, you can just simply do anything that you would like. But it wasn't always really like that. There used to be a time when India would struggle to play against England and Australia. South Africa had refused to play against India because the team comprised of players, none of which were white. So that was a legacy of South Africa's apartheid regime, which India and Pakistan had fought against tooth and nail. But even then, their voices were quite peripheral in the ICC and in the matters of running global cricket until very recently. So my forthcoming project is really it's not about India's ascendancy in global cricket, because that's something which happened much later, from the 1980s onward, which was given a new wind of life in the 1990s. But I'm talking about the 1950s, when cricket was still considered to be an English, imperial, alien game, which was yet to take root all over India in the manner in which we imagine or consider cricket as India's foremost game at this point. There are debates regarding which game should be India's national game. So when we were kids, we used to think of Kabaddi as India's national game, but that was a thought which was more prevalent in Eastern India. In North India, most of the history textbooks and general knowledge books in general would consider hockey to be India's national game. Now, Kabaddi is more indigenous. It has bigger claims to representing Indian nationhood. Hockey, much like cricket, is a foreign import during the colonial times, but cricket was considered to be alien and English and imperial in a way that hockey wasn't. It was domesticated in a very different manner. So that kind of led me to think about the ways in which Indians had started domesticating cricket in the 1940s and the 1950s, which broadly corresponds with the political process of decolonization. And I wanted to explore the ways in which India tried to disentangle itself from this global culture of Englishness or the British world in which India was a very prominent part, and how it tried to win against these sorts of British notions of culture and social formations and social relationships, and how it tried to indigenize these sorts of imperial cultures into a post-colonial legacy. And I tried to do some of that in my first book, which was about the role of cricket in the making of a specific post-colonial culture in Calcutta, but I wanted to look at the bigger picture in my second book, which would be encompassing two things generally. So one is India's international relations. At the time when India was becoming decolonized in the 1940s and 50s, decolonization is an ongoing process. So we cannot really specify that something has already ended at a specific juncture and it has been replaced by something else. It hasn't. But the main thing is that when India was trying to shape its nationhood with specific governmental models in mind, be it democracy, be it republicanism, be it secularism, my argument in the book is that cricket played an often unacknowledged role in that, which no historian has even tried to look at. Historians have a thing against looking at sports sometimes, so which kind of explains why there are like so few works dealing with the history of sports in India. I cannot really name more than 5 or 6 academic monographs on this topic, though it's good to see that many upcoming scholars are looking at cricket, hockey, football, and many other sports and trying to link them to the making of different social and political formations. But that's something which we can perhaps celebrate very soon in the future. But then, coming back to the topic at hand, the book will mainly have 2 segments. One will deal with India's international relations in the 1940s and 50s, and the second would be about the domestic policies that the Indian government had undertaken in conjunction with the different provinces of India, which was being reshaped in different ways throughout the 1950s. There were several provinces that were yet to be born in the 1950s, which came up later. And provinces were being reshaped according to language, culture, polity, and various other things. Around this time, in 1957, the government of India's education ministry had issued a directive to the most prominent physical culture institutes of each of the Indian states, which were about 25 or 26 in number. There were 2 institutes which were considered worthy of giving attention to in that time. So they had responded to the questionnaire according to what they considered to be the 5 most popular sport in the state. And these days we would readily think about cricket and football being the most popular sports in most of the Indian states. But in 1957, cricket topped the charts in just 3 of the 25 odd states, and football was the most popular sport in about 4 or 5 states. There were plenty of mentions of volleyball, even handball, which was not exactly a men's sport even in that time, swimming and archery, various other sports. So it's not that cricket and to an extent football and hockey were the only sports that Indians excelled at or were quite confident about playing. But if you look at the media discourse and the political discourse of the time, almost all the emphasis on creating a sporting culture in India centered on just two or three sports. There were athletics for sure. The Indian government, particularly under the Nehru regime, the Indian government tried to do a lot for promoting athletics throughout the country, but it spectacularly failed to do so. There was this special issue published by the Illustrated Weekly of India magazine in 1964. And the heading of that was "What Ails Indian Sport?" And it featured about 10 or 12 different articles on what were the problems regarding all the Indian sports that we can know about. And they talked about the inefficiency of administration, the lack of proper training, the lack of proper infrastructure, the lack of coaching training. These are the things which we talk about even today, even after 50 or 60 odd years. So very little has changed in the sporting landscape of India, which has led to kind of a derision that India has so many people, but it's still not exactly worthy of winning too many medals at the Olympic Games or in other world events. The only exception being cricket, in which India has performed quite commendably over the last 30 odd years, winning several World Cups, various prestigious matches. And it's the only sport other than chess in which India has consistently ranked amongst the top countries over a period of 30 odd years. But it all started with the government's intervention in cricket in the late 1940s, particularly 1946 onward. So all the other sports did not really get the government's patronage in the way that cricket did. I'm not exactly claiming that the government patronized cricket quite significantly, and that's what made cricket tick in contemporary India. In 1968 or 1969, when England was supposed to tour India for a 5-day series, the government of India was undergoing a credit crunch. It did not really have a lot of pounds in the national exchequer, as a result of which it could not really guarantee the England's national team the guarantee money that the BCCI owed them. So England refused to tour India. They were replaced by Australia after that. There have been several other cricket tours which had to be cancelled because the Indian government did not really support the BCCI financially. And there have been instances in which a provincial cricket council in Madhya Pradesh, for instance, in 1952, it asked for a loan of 2,000 rupees from the government of India for building a new stadium. And the application was refused. So it's not that the government was terribly enthusiastic about helping cricket more than other sports. The story of the ascendancy of cricket was basically about some canny businessmen going into BCCI and trying to run BCCI as a successful industry, which did not happen in other sports. The government did its role in other ways, particularly after 1945, after the end of the Second World War, when cricket resumed after a long hiatus of about 6 years. One of the first countries to join the cricketing bandwagon at the time was India. It had played 2 test series in England in the 1930s, and England was supposed to tour India in 1939-1940. The itinerary and all the travel arrangements were made, but then Second World War broke out, and the team could not travel. Most of the cricketers had to be dispersed. Some of them joined the war effort. Cricketers like Dennis Compton and several other English cricketers were stationed in India during the Second World War, and they did not have to fight as such, but rather they kept up the troops' morale, and they were kind of physical instructors in some of the instances. Some of them even played domestic cricket in India. And after the war was over, India really expected England to tour India quite soon in 1946, arguing that England had committed to touring India in 1939 and they should be the first nation to get this honor of an English visit. Now, the MCC was quite weakened at the time financially and also in terms of the availability of cricketers for the tour. So they argued that most of the cricketers were still on active war duty, so they could not really mobilize a group of cricketers to come to India after such a stressful event. Rather, they invited India to go to Britain and play a 3-test series. There were some political wranglings involved in that regarding the selection of the captain and so on. I'm not really going into those sorts of details, but the tour really symbolized a post-war return to normality in Britain, where no first-class cricket had taken place for over 6 years. However, the British press were not terribly enthusiastic about greeting India because they thought that India was quite weak as a side. So they were quite surprised when the MCC had announced the tour. One of the leading newspapers of the time, which was the Evening Dispatch, they called the tour an injustice to all the other empire sides, insinuating that the other cricketing nations had stronger claims to that opportunity than India. Other newspapers, like the Daily News, considered the tour a good opportunity to prepare the England team for the next series, which was going to take place against Australia. And this was the view that was widely endorsed in the British press. So there was this perception that the Indian tour was mainly a trial series, and it shows that the British press did not really take Indian cricket seriously enough. But according to documents published later on, rather declassified by the British government and the MCC, both these parties used to think of this tour as a diplomatic exercise, which is where the agency of the Indian politicians in making cricket a sport that needs to be taken seriously comes to the fore. It's not that the MCC was quite embracing of other cricketing nations at the time. Sri Lanka, which was called Ceylon at the time, had applied for ICC membership in 1948, but then the ICC did not really think that Ceylon was worthy enough to join the ICC and play international cricket, which happened much later. Ceylon was still a British Crown colony and not an independent nation when the application came through. But then India was treated somewhat differently because of India's strong geographical location, which was kind of the center of all the British commercial and military operations in South and Southeast Asia. So they wanted to retain India as a very valuable ally in the Imperial Federation. They knew that the empire's days were numbered in the Indian subcontinent, and India would be gaining its independence soon enough. It did not really think that it would be so soon in 1947. Most of the cricket administrators in Britain at the time thought that they would be able to retain India's allegiance to the British Empire for quite some time, despite the nationalist movement, which did not really make so much of a mark in their minds to take Indian politics seriously enough. That's something that I can discuss later on. But then the main thing was that the Indian press and the Indian politicians, especially the Indian Foreign Office at the time, they tried to treat the 1946 tour as an acknowledgement that Britain was grateful to India for its support in the Second World War. There were plenty of souvenir publications that came up in this period. In one of those souvenirs, the High Commissioner for India in Britain, who was Sir Samuel Ranganathan in this period, he emphasized on the existing goodwill between Britain and India, and he expressed his hope that the tour would enhance the friendly relations between the two countries. So even when nationalist movement was reaching its peak, it had already reached its peak before the tour took place, but then there were other Indians who were talking about having friendly relations with Britain. There were plenty of photographs which were taken, later published and circulated quite widely. There were profile sketches of all these English and Indian cricketers who took place in the matches in the series, and all of them carried kind of a distinct imperialist overtone. And this overtone was became much more prominent when we think about the kind of people that the Indian cricketing delegation met in Britain in 1946 when they were touring there. So at the same time, many Indian nationalists were kind of venting their anger at the British and towards cricket as an imperial game that they thought should be abolished. One of the key proponents of this claim was B.V. Kelkar, Balkrishna Kelkar, who was a Congress politician, and he was the General Secretary of Congress at the time. And he was completely against cricket. He wanted cricket to be abolished. He thought that cricket was a game that was purely English in culture and spirit. And he argued that cricket would not be able to survive the disappearance of British rule from India. But then there were plenty of other Indians who objected to this vision of cricket as a terrain of political conflict. Several of them were quite critical of Keskar, and plenty of other voices which tried to silence cricket in India or silence the growth of cricket in India. But then the BCCI in particular, even though we can be quite strong critiques of how the BCCI has kind of carried out its role as the custodian of Indian cricket, in 1946, it did something that was politically quite significant. It asked the MCC to address India, to address the team as India rather than All India, which was the name that was printed on many of the souvenirs published by the MCC. So that was the name given to the Indian sides which used to tour England in the 1930s. It used to be called All India. But then all the official correspondences and scorecards in the 1946 series used the term India. And it was the first time when this name, this word, India, was put on the world map by a sporting side. So it was one of the first instances of India gaining national importance in the context of cricket. Now, the BCCI president at the time was a guy named Anthony de Mello, and he was quite nationalist in his disposition. He was quite optimistic that cricket would be able to regenerate India and the world that was kind of quite ravaged by the Second World War. And he wrote a foreword to a book which was edited by Bedi Sarbadhikari. And he wrote that the Indian cricket team would play the game in the same spirit as it's played in England. And if possible, they would like to beat the Englishmen at their own game and on their own soil. So that was kind of an intense desire to emulate the colonizer. And de Mello also hoped that the tour would promote kind of greater understanding between the peoples of the two countries. And that kind of resonated with the larger expectation of restoring peace to the world. The matches were more or less free of political disturbances. The captain of the Indian side at the time was Nawab of Pataudi Senior, Iftikhar Ali Khan Pataudi. He shied away from making any political statements in the press conferences when asked about the Indian freedom struggle and the nationalist movement. He would divert the question to cricketing affairs. So he kind of played an ambassadorial role, who was expected to represent India in its post-war avatar to the outside world. And when you look at the kind of people that the Indian cricketers met, it was like full of luminaries from the political and military world. So there were several dinners which were organized in honor of the touring party. When the MCC organized a dinner, the person who was sitting at the top table was Stanley Jackson, who was not just India's former captain, but he used to be the governor of Bengal and subject to a very famous assassination attempt. Now, he was hosting Indian cricketers in England. There would be the undersecretaries and secretaries of state for different things, which were kind of the shorthands for ministers. And the High Commissioner, Deputy High Commissioner of India and other political territories, all the counts and viscounts and plenty of earls and barons would be sitting at the table with the Indian cricketers, which kind of shows you that India was considered to be an important future ally of a British empire, which was decolonizing quite rapidly. And as a result of which, even before India's independence, India was absolutely not barred from playing international cricket as a separate country, which is something that Pakistan faced to an extent because it took longer than India to frame its constitution after its independence. Both countries kind of became independent at the same time, 5 minutes apart. But while India became a republic in 1950, it had adopted and exercised its rights to a constitution. Pakistan took longer, and its constitution was not framed until 1954, and it became a republic in 1955. That kind of raised a debate regarding Pakistan's ability to play international cricket, because Pakistan team was quite strong at the point, even stronger than India. And they had started winning on foreign soils from the very beginning. They had beaten England in 1954, something that the Indians had to wait until 1971 to accomplish. So they were a pretty strong team at this side. But then, who was the country that supported Pakistan's bid to be able to play international cricket? According to Abdul Hafiz Kardar, who had played cricket for both India and Pakistan, India before Pakistan's independence for sure on the 1946 tour. He was a very important batter of the time, and after the tour, who stayed back in England to study in Oxford, and then he returned to Pakistan, and he was one of the foremost anti-India figures in Pakistan at the point. He would always speak ill about Indian cricketers, the Indian nation in general, and definitely he was one of the strongest critiques of Indian politicians and India's policy towards Kashmir in particular and Pakistan in general. So he writes in a book called Green Shadows that it was West Indies which supported Pakistan's bid to become the ICC member in 1952 and be able to play international cricket. But the main thing is that it was India which proposed that Pakistan should be included, and the move was seconded by England. West Indies doesn't even feature in this entire story. And India was the first country to invite Pakistan to its shores to play a 5-match series, which kind of shows us a different side of India's diplomatic efforts in this time. So the story of Indo-Pakistan cricket since 1947 has been one of stops and starts. There have been long hiatuses in which no cricket has taken place between the two countries. And then there have been instances such as between 2003 and 2007, before the terror attacks took place. Pakistan and India kind of played like 25% of all its matches in the history of the bilateral relationship in those 5 years. So India would be playing Pakistan every now and then, almost every month, which kind of was becoming a bit boring at the time because Pakistani cricket was not really as strong as it used to be in the 1990s. So the matches were more or less one-sided in India's favor. They did not really make for good sporting context. So it was a new challenge for India after 1947 to trying to leverage cricket to strengthen its position as a sovereign power. So there hasn't been too much research. So there are some sporadic research on regarding the politics of memberships of international bodies in this period, such as the UN, the UNICEF later on, and then sporting organizations like FIFA or IOC. So in the 1940s and 50s, when plenty of Asian and African nations were gradually becoming independent of foreign rule, not just India, but countries starting from Angola to Indonesia, which were becoming decolonized in this period to an extent, did not always have sovereign status in the eyes of the UN, the way in which they define nationhood and sovereignty. But all these countries tried to make a mark in the world by trying to promote themselves as individual sporting nations. So we have seen plenty of instances in which countries became members of the FIFA or the IOC even before they became UN members or were considered to be sovereign nations in their own rights. So this politics of membership of these supranational organizations tells us a lot about how the global landscape of politics and how the concept of sovereignty was being redefined throughout the 1940s and 50s, and how sport played a very important role in that, because most of the nations that we are talking about when we talk about decolonization try to use sport as a political tool for being recognized as a nation in their own rights, which was not terribly forthcoming in other ways. So there have been plenty of instances of countries boycotting several mega events, like when India had organized the Asian Games in 1951. Nehru basically tried to use sport to promote Pan-Asian friendship, but only 9 nations had joined his call. And the subsequent Asian Games were more successful than that, but definitely Nehru has to be given credit for trying to unify Asia culturally through the use of sport. And Nehru was also the main promoter of the fact that India needed to have a sports segment in the education ministry, and it needed to take sport very seriously in order to build a healthy and successful and powerful nation, because he thought that, well, a healthy mind can only reside in a healthy body, just triggering the aphorism a bit. So he tried to promote sporting culture quite substantially in the 1950s, most of which fell flat. That would be kind of the second half of my book. So let me just talk about that for a couple of minutes, and I can move back to the first half that is more important for the present discussion. So mainly Nehru had created a lot of new committees for promoting sport, for promoting the understanding of physical education, and it became a mandatory part of the school curriculum and exams as well. If you fail in the physical education class, you fail the entire course. That's how physical education became part of general school education in India for the first time. It wasn't really mandatory in the British period. And Nehru spent a lot of money trying to develop better coaching methods and infrastructure in India. Plenty of new stadiums came up across the country. Most of them came up in North India because that was the major center for Congress power. So they got a majority of the resources. And then plenty of coaches were sent abroad. Plenty of foreign coaches were invited to come to India and train the local coaches and athletes. And all this kind of evaporated, that disappeared after 1958. There is a damning report in the National Archives of India, which tells one that the government was terribly disappointed by how these coaches and officials of India were simply looking at these foreign trips as holiday, not really learning as much as they should, and implementing nothing really. So they were being highly ineffective, and the government had then decided to shut down this sporting industry that was barely flourishing in India at the very beginning, because they thought it was something that was not really yielding the outcomes that were desirable. So sport was used for nation building in this time, but some unscrupulous government officials and coaches made sure that it did not really happen in the way it could happen in the West. Most of the Western European countries, throughout much of North India, North America, and China and Japan, for instance. China was the ultimate success story regarding how well the government officials and coaches reciprocated the government's objective of creating China as a powerful sporting nation by doing just the right things, which has led to first the doubling and then maybe it has gone up 100 times since they joined the Olympic movement. The medal tally is something really to marvel at. That never could take place in India because of internal corruption and the inefficiency of much of the sporting bodies. So that would be the second half of my book, why it all fell apart and how things were being built up on a much more optimistic side is the first half, in which I talk about three things mainly. India's dealings with England in this period, how the two countries viewed themselves as quite powerful, valuable allies in regulating world affairs. And then India had found some unlikely friends in Australia and New Zealand as well, which was quite surprising because of the White Australia policy that was undertaken in this period. They were extremely racist as a nation, and there were lots of problems meted out towards Indians who tried to settle in Australia and New Zealand in this period. But one of the few peoples who were warmly welcomed to those countries were the cricket teams of India, to an extent Pakistan's as well. You would know that India's first High Commissioner to Australia was a cricketer, Dalip Singh Ji. And he played his role quite perfectly in trying to build the two countries closer together through building up sporting ties. So throughout the 1950s and 60s and 70s, we have seen plenty of instances of England not exactly enthusiastically traveling to India, or sometimes just sending second string sides because the top players were not really interested in going to India and playing there because of the hostile people, the political environment. They did not quite like the food in India, and generally they quite despised Indian people in short. So in 1951, when the Commonwealth team was being waved off from Fenchurch Street Station in London, the secretary of the MCC was believed to have told the team's coach that it's a good thing that I don't have to go to India because I hate educated Indians. So these are the refrains that kind of come up quite powerfully, quite regularly through these discourses of the relationship between Britain and India in this period. But India did not really have to face such obstacles in its dealings with Australia or New Zealand. The Australians would regularly tour India in the 1950s, 60s. So I was talking about the English tour that was cancelled in 1969, and they were promptly replaced by an Australian side. New Zealand even took a lot of interest in promoting goodwill, and mainly they were trying to strengthen their hold on the ASEAN region in South and Southeast Asia, and they thought that they would needed to have India as their ally in this to have a commercial foothold in that region. So in 1956, when New Zealand first toured India, most of the cricketers were quite unwilling to travel to India, thinking that it's kind of an insanitary, diseased environment that they shouldn't risk their lives going in. They weren't really exposed to the Indian climate in the way that some of the British cricketers had because of the strong links between the two countries, which New Zealand did not have. So one of the most famous New Zealand batters of the time and for the posterity as well, Bert Sutcliffe, writes in his autobiography that he was kind of forced by the New Zealand government to lead the team to India. They said that he did not really want to undertake the tour, but he was called to the government office, to the Prime Minister's office, no less. And the Prime Minister did not meet him, but there were secretaries of the state who met him, and they told him about the desirability of having a strong diplomatic relationship with India. So these are the stories that we need to keep in mind when thinking about the role that sport had played in strengthening India's reputation as a global partner, a valuable ally for some of the more developed countries, some of the more first world countries, which kind of were the beneficiaries of colonialism in a way that India wasn't. So the 1950s was kind of the time when a new world order was taking shape. And there were plenty of things that India did at the time, trying to come up with world-class education through the establishment of IITs and IIMs, some large-scale engineering products, the Green Revolution, rapidly increasing agricultural productivity, and science, technology, education, to an extent, cultural exchanges were kind of the part of this bigger story of how India tried to promote its nationhood, its sovereignty in the wake of its independence, much of which took place in the Nehruvian period in the 1950s. So it was the time when India started establishing cultural centers in most of the other places. The Nehru Center came up in 1961 in London. It wasn't called Nehru Center at the time. It was renamed later after Nehru's death. But there were plenty of other instances, such as inviting dance troupes or theater troupes from different countries, patronized by these local cultural groups, such as the BBC, or many of the times all the British councils in India were quite active in kind of promoting this sorts of friendship through cultural forms. The only place in which the Indian government took a lead in trying to promote these sorts of ambassadorial roles and agencies of certain people in doing so was through outdoor sports, and cricket was constituted of 95% of the government's effort. So with that in mind, they invited Pakistan to tour India in 1951-52, which was the first time that Pakistan had played international cricket. And then the Indian government had accepted an invitation to go to Pakistan in 1954 and 55. And some of you would know about the significance of the test match in Lahore in creating kind of new diplomatic initiatives to bring India and Pakistan closer together. It was the time when the Indus Waters Treaty was still being prepared, but there were already talks of demilitarizing the border to ease the burden on the national economies of both these countries, because both of them were struggling financially because most of their efforts had to go towards infrastructure building, and they could not really afford to have large militaries. So there were parts of de-escalating tension between the two countries in the middle of the 1950s, which kind of reached its apex during the Lahore Test match, which was the first time since the two countries' independence that the borders were opened up and temporary visas were issued to any Indian who wanted to go to Lahore to watch the test match. On one single day, 30,000 Indians crossed over to Pakistan. Not all of them were able to see the test match because Lahore Stadium was not really as gigantic as it is now, but it could hold perhaps like 30 or 40,000 people in all. So many of the Indians who traveled to Pakistan simply reveled in local hospitality, and there was no political confrontation at all that was reported by the press. Rather, it was kind of a story that was full of goodwill. So many political commentators were quite apprehensive regarding the response that these sorts of moves would generate, because for many of them, partition was still a living memory, and the brutalities that many of their families had encountered were quite fresh in their memories yet. But then the situation turned out to be pretty different. There were plenty of goodwill between the two countries. All the newspapers, the politicians were terribly happy. And when the Pakistani president came to Calcutta, he had a stopover in Calcutta before going to Dhaka for a political meet, and he briefly met Nehru at the Calcutta International Airport. And apparently the two had a very lengthy chat about how India and Pakistan could work together to bring peace to the Indian subcontinent. And one of the upshots of that was this negotiation that the two countries would ease the mobility of people between their territories. It was already extended to players because in the early 1950s, particularly between 1950 and 1954, several Pakistani athletes used to come to India and take part in India's national tournaments, like the Indian Open, which was an Indian tournament, Pakistani footballers would play for domestic sides in the Durand Cup, which was again supposed to be a national tournament, not exactly international. But these sorts of mobilities happened in sports, if not in anything else. So sport kind of played quite an important role in trying to reshape the way in which India and Pakistan saw each other and saw themselves reflecting on their bilateral relationship. So, but most of these exercises eventually fell flat because, again, due to the inefficiency of the politicians on both sides, even though the Lahore Test match and the mobility of the people and the goodwill it generated was acknowledged by the press across the border, most of the politicians were not really able to replicate the success of cricket. Even though the Indus Water Treaty was finally signed in 1960, giving Pakistan a fair share of the water that was generated in Tibet, which flowed through India and then towards Pakistan, the politicians were not really able to replicate the same success regarding the de-escalation of tensions. If anything, it just went on between 1961 and 1978. India and Pakistan did not play any test match or any cricket match at all. So it was a fairly short-lived story of triumph of diplomacy through sport. But even then, sport was something that kind of defined India's diplomatic efforts quite substantially throughout the 1950s, because that was one of the few resources that India had which spoke a universal language which was at their disposal for making claims of their sovereignty heard. So I guess I could just go on and on regarding this with plenty of other case studies and examples, but I would like to stop here and have a conversation with all of you regarding what you thought, and I'm open to questions and happy to discuss more.
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful talk. Now, I will ask our audience in YouTube and Facebook so they can just post their questions on the chat box so I can read the questions for sir. And both join in the today's G Meet. You can also unmute yourselves and ask questions to directly Professor. So I'm just checking the. Okay, Dipojyoti raised a hand. Please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hello, sir. Hope you are doing well. I'm Debojyoti, and thanks for the lecture. My question is kind of going back to the decades of the late 1930s and the early part of the 1940s, and that related with the domestic structure of the India's cricket tournament. So we know that there was a tournament in Bombay, pentangular, quadrangular, then pentangular. There was the anti-pentangular movement, and you were talking about the notions of the secularism that in the kind of nationalism in the wake of independence. So my question is that how can we conceptualize that communal structure of the tournament in the late 1930s and the early 1940s to to see the two terms, that is the secularism and the communalism, in the Indian context when there was a growing sense of nationalism in 1940s? Like, did it hurt the idea of the quote unquote united India at that time, or the idea of the inclusive nationalism? Because there were reports that even Mahatma Gandhi, condemned that kind of communal structure of the tournament. So my question is related about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Devajyoti. That is a very interesting question for sure, because yes, Mahatma Gandhi was definitely the most powerful voice in Indian politics, and he declared that the pentangular tournament cannot really go on because it was more divisive than inclusive, because caste and religion were built as the major building blocks of the teams that comprised the tournament. But then the tournament was quite contradictory in itself. While it was based on on specific communities, and it kind of subsumed most of these non-communitarian identities under this moniker of the rest, which was added as the fifth team in 1937. So it kind of comprised of cricketers who did not really identify as either Hindu or Muslim or European. Now, we need to realize that most of these cricketers themselves who played in the Pentangular tournament, and that included Abdul Hafiz Kardar as well, who was strongly anti-India, anti-Hindu, whatever. He did not exactly perceive the Pentangular tournament as communal in nature, because he thought that all these clubs had to have some sort of similarity in the upbringing of their cricketers, or some sort of identity guiding them in their participation. So it was quite similar to how most of the clubs in England or in the British world in general, in the wider British world, they were based out of class identities. In India, class identity was not really as strong as a marker of identity as caste or religion. So this was mainly why religion became kind of a building block of this structure of the major tournaments. And the Pentangular tournament, particularly its structure, was replicated in many other places as well. There was one Pentangular tournament in Bhopal, there was one in Sindh, one in Balochistan, and in most of these tournaments, the spectators or the athletes who participated in them, they did not really complain about any ill feeling generated by communalism or simply by the fact that they belonged to different religions, which kind of had their internal and external tensions at the time. But all those sorts of political wranglings and bickerings were not exactly externalized to how communal cricket was perceived in this period. So the same thing was perceived by some people as essentially communal and inimical to Indian nationhood, but other cricketers and commentators of the time would consider them to be simply something related to their identities, because identities are kind of immutable in one's lifetime until and unless one converts to a different religion. Now, I can be an atheist, but if I am born in a Hindu or Muslim family, I will be labeled by the Indian government as either Hindu or Muslim, because they don't really consider atheism to be a religion or a valid identity. So these were the problems in understanding or defining identity that persisted throughout this period. And there are definitely two sides to the story. But having said that, the Pentangular tournament was quite successful in the end. And even though it was eventually replaced by the Ranji Trophy, which was much more inclusive, if we talk about religion or these sorts of cultural identities, any sort of tournament is bound to be divisive, because the Ranji Trophy was played between different provinces, and the 1950s was kind of a time for provincialism to replace all other political dissents or dissensions that we saw previously in the first half of the 20th century. So provincialism is not a huge problem in 2025, but having grown up in the 1990s, I could see that it was considered to be a big conflict. So Bengalis would be ridiculed by Punjabis, and Punjabis would be ridiculed by people from the south, and it all happened to a large extent through their athletic abilities and their participation in sport. So I would say that just one dogma replaces the other in the larger scheme of things.
Thank you, sir. Just one small query about that. Pentangular was also a strong source for revenue, and it also had a commercialized character. So when it was replaced by the Ranji in the 1940s or all, so how the Ranji acted in that revenue sphere? Did it generate that kind of revenue in the Indian cricket, or it was lessened?
No, it didn't. It barely generated any revenue in the first years of its existence. It started generating revenue only very recently, when the BCCI became extremely rich in the 21st century and started paying the cricketers more for playing in Ranji Trophy. Otherwise, it barely attracts any sponsors even now. So the BCCI it basically invests in Ranji Trophy to prepare players for a career in international cricket, which in turns gives them a lot of revenues. The Ranji Trophy never gets any revenues as such.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
So thank you, sir. And we have one question in our chat box I can read. So Rakhi Mondal is asking a question that post-colonial theories like Frantz Fanon argue that true decolonization requires dismantling colonial structures, not just repurposing them under native control. If cricket remains a fundamentally British colonial construct dominated by elite controlled institutions like the BCCI, can we genuinely call it a post colonial success? Or is it a continuation of colonial power under Indian management, where the natives, in quote, have merely assumed the roles once held by their imperial masters?
That is a very interesting question. Yeah, one of the biggest criticisms of Fanon is definitely that since he was first and foremost a political activist who kind of took part in the nation's armed struggle against colonialism, and he had seen his comrades die around him. His family was imprisoned because of his political convictions and activities. He was kind of one of the staunchest believers in the fact that one can never be successfully decolonized until and after one has completely dismantled the colonial structures. But then perhaps Fanon did not, when Fanon had come up with two of his most successful books in the 1950s, he was still part of a society that was being dominated by colonialism. France was still in control of much of North Africa when Fanon was writing his books. So his views differ from other post-colonial thinkers, particularly those who talk about the cultural legacies of colonialism, such as Achille Mbembe, who has talked about what is a post-colony, and various other scholars from Francophone Africa, to an extent India as well, who are of the opinion that colonialism and post-colonialism are kind of in a temporal sense, one can never really understand where the colonial ends and the post-colonial begins. So the transition is never really clear-cut. In some instances, colonialism can still have complete authority over how people think. So the mentalities of the people cannot be differentiated or disentangled from specific ways of thinking that has been cultivated through an external force or a power for over 2 centuries in some instances. So there isn't a very clear-cut answer to your question, but just that different people consider the colonial moment and the post-colonial resistance differently, their modes differently. As such, there is no consensus amongst the scholars. For myself, if you like to know my personal opinion, I would be quite critical of Fanon in this case, because I don't really think that you can ever dismantle a structure which has held absolute power over a large number of people over vast territories for 200 to 300 years. It simply cannot happen overnight. It takes almost at least a century. But even that's kind of a figurative estimate. Perhaps it will never happen again. So the ways that the British have infused the ways we think, the ways we behave, the ways we talk, everything Indian about ourselves is genuinely inflected by British values, which were imposed on us from above. They kind of intermingled with local sentiments, and they created a matrix in which the colonial, the imperial, and the post-colonial are extremely different, are extremely difficult to disentangle or differentiate. So my answer would be that you can never really truly dismantle this sorts of structure or can truly be decolonized or a post-colonial entity. It's a process rather than an event or an incident which goes on. The most we can do is try to understand how it happens, and how exactly it influences new social relationships.
Thank you, sir. So we will now take questions from our YouTube channel chat box. So there is a question asked by Arnav Rokit. So asking that post-independence Indian cricket has once projected as a symbol of national self-assertion, yet today it has become a hyper-commercialized, globalized entity dominated by market forces. Does the rise of the IPL and corporate sponsorship signal the transformation of cricket from a nationalist symbol to a new liberal commodity? How does this shift align with David Harvey's theory of neoliberalism and the commodification of cultural symbols? So,
Right, that's a loaded question, which will take me half an hour to answer. So, in short, Obhibshu Haldar has written about neoliberalism and Indian cricket. You must look at that article that kind of answers all these questions, and he has also talked about Harvey's theories, space compression and distanciation, and how neoliberalism has kind of engulfed the sport industry from the 1990s onwards. There have been regional variations for sure. There are some countries which have been exposed to the neoliberal movement earlier than others, such as the UK and the US, particularly with Thatcherism. It started in the UK sport. It came later to India in the late 1990s when the market winds were blowing in a way in which India was suddenly identified as the preferred destination of transnational capital. And it was the same time when the BCCI felt the urge to expand its activities, and they found willing supporters from plenty of these transnational capitalism sectors. So it was a success story for sure, and Indian cricket changed quite irrevocably after that. It has kind of retained a distinctive identity as the mouthpiece of the people. It kind of a win in a cricket match kind of increases national confidence. There have been articles written on how a cricket win kind of influences stock market behaviors. It makes people take risky decisions because they are kind of on a high since India has won against Australia or England on the previous day. So it kind of influences people's behavior at a cultural level. But otherwise, cricket, like any other sport, is kind of big business. Sport is no longer just a pastime or a recreation. It's one of the largest transnational industries in the world, and cricket is no exception. And fortunately for Indians, it is being driven by the Indian Cricket Board in the context of this particular sport, which has empowered India to take a lot of decisions that wouldn't have been possible even before. So yeah, that's the long and short of it. I mean, to answer it properly, it would take me half an hour for sure, but definitely read that article. It has all the answers that you need.
thank you, sir. We'll move to the next question. It's asked by Mariam Begum. She's asking that we all know the concept of imagined communities suggests the national identity is discursively constructed rather than naturally inherited. How much of India's post-independence cricketing identity is a fabricated natural myth perpetuated through media and state apparatus rather than an organic form of national consciousness? To what extent does cricket mask the internal fractures of caste, region, and class in India?
Again, that's a great question. So that's what the first chapter of my first book was about. Cricket was just a game before Indians started taking it so seriously that it kind of became imbued with different senses of nationhood and various other identities, and how it really happened. So my argument was that it had happened through the media, and cricket, to an extent football, got kind of an uneven representation in the sport pages. Cricket was always a sport that was considered to be the barometer of the nation's sentiment, and it's something that started being propagated as an ideology in late 19th century England. So football did not really have a big literature like cricket had. So there was this cartoon which came out in 1999 in a newspaper named The Star. So it was called The Relative Importance of Things. And it came out on 26th December. So that is quite important because it's Boxing Day. So it shows like 5 or 6 male figures and how they stack up against each other in their importance to the British nation. So there was like weather, which was like represented like a figure like which was this big, then the latest divorce, latest political scandal, like cricket was like this big. So it showed that cricket was more important than anything else. What was the reality? An average cricket match was able to draw about like 5,000 to 6,000 spectators. On an average day, about like 30 to 40,000 people went to the football pitch in 1999. So football was much more popular, much more widely captivating than cricket. But the media ensured that cricket was in the limelight throughout the year, not just in the English summer. So they were talking about the importance of cricket in winter on 26th of December when there was no cricket in the country at all. So that is the main thing to consider, that the media the media kind of caters to the tastes of its audience. And sometimes it also tries to create distinctive tastes. So in India, in particular, most of these English language newspapers, to an extent, all the vernacular newspapers were owned by people who were kind of members of the capitalist class. Sometimes they were like involved in the freedom struggle, but the most important identity, which was common to all of them, but they were extremely elite and upper class. They all liked cricket, and they all tried to promote cricket in a way that cricket towered above all other sports in its disposition. They always tried to give more space to reporting cricket. So in the 1930s or 40s, the sports page was much more democratic. It used to be quite large, I would say. If there were like 3 pages of sport news that a newspaper carried, one of those pages would be on cricket and the 2 other would be devoted to all other sports. Right now, like 80% of the news of the sport pages is just devoted to cricket, to the detriment of all other sports. So I would not really claim that cricket has killed other sports. It hasn't, but definitely the media has promoted cricket in a way that it seems to be the most accessible, the most widely enjoyed, and the sport which kind of is indicative of our aspirations as a nation. So it's kind of an elite conspiracy.
Thank you, sir. For now, I will take some questions from our Facebook channel. So it's asked by Aditya Shankar Chattopadhyay. He's asking that cricket is often framed within the nationalist discourse, yet the sport itself operates in a transitional post-colonial matrix, with the ICC, corporate franchises, and media conglomerates shaping its evolution. To what extent has cricket moved beyond nationalistic symbolism to become a site of post-colonial global governance, where power is still concentrated in former imperial centers like England and Australia?
Mhm. Yeah, that's an important question. We haven't really moved over from the nationalist ideologies that were kind of imbricated within cricket. Just look at how Indian and Pakistani cricket officials and government personnel talk to each other when it comes to cricket. So you would have seen that Shahid Afridi was one of the few Pakistani cricketers who have ever been critical of the Indian government. Shoaib Akhtar and Inzamam, they all are extremely happy talking about how good the Indian cricketers were as friends and the kind of hospitality that they had received. And here, Anurag Thakur is kind of quite infamous for asking people, rousing people to just identify pro-Pakistan elements from within the Indian intelligentsia. And he was giving slogans for the mob to lynch them. Goli Maro Saloko and all that. And a few days ago in Dubai, they were seen sitting together chatting about cricket or many other things. So that's the thing. Cricket has been used for political gains by people like Afridi, and then plenty of Indian politicians. There are like too many to name, really. But then cricket still kinds of holds nationalism, national identity, and the senses of nationhood in its matrix quite strongly. So we cannot exactly disentangle cricket from nationalism. It's used for political motives in a very narrow sense, which is exemplified through India's relationship with Pakistan in the last 15 odd years. But other than that, cricket has also allowed us to express certain feelings, sentiments that can be considered to be post-colonial, like Indian people living in Britain and yet having the freedom to cheer for the Indian team. So if you would like to buy tickets for any match involving England, you have to buy your India tickets well in advance on the day in which the tickets are released. Otherwise, everything is going to go up for grabs for the Indian people who live in England. Otherwise, for Australia matches or New Zealand matches, you can just turn up at the gates and buy ticket on the day. They're not exactly sold out. So cricket has kind of given post-colonial Indians, Pakistanis even, and West Indians in particular, it all started with them, the means to assert their supremacy as a nation and also made their voices heard.
So thank you, sir. So we'll take another question from Facebook. Is asked by Shantan Shorkar. He's asking that Homi Bhabha's concept of mimicry suggests that post-colonial subjects often replicate colonial structures under the guise of autonomy.
Yeah.
Is Indian cricket truly a site of post-colonial resistance, or does it represent an act of colonial mimicry where success in a colonial sport is mistaken for genuine decolonization? Are we still playing for the empire but under a different flag?
Now, that's a good question. Again, I will refer back to the first chapter of my book where I have kind of answered this question. There is no such thing as genuine decolonization. It can never happen, because when, suppose, a white person is talking to you and you feel, I mean, as an Indian, when we feel that we are being inferiorized, we don't exactly know whether he's genuinely looking down upon me as a person or as an Indian, whether there is a racial element involved in that. You cannot really differentiate between these things which act in a subliminal level. So yeah, there cannot really be complete decolonization, but there can be transitions within the boundaries of how we perceive identities, how we kind of reshape our relationships with other people, former colonizers, complete foreigners, people who love cricket, people who hate cricket. There have been plenty of Indians who have hated cricket with a vengeance. Several politicians, particularly after India's independence, in Mumbai, in Pune, there was this person called S.V. Damle who was completely against cricket. And he kind of started a political campaign that none of the schools in Pune should have a cricket pitch or a cricket coach or a cricket team. Now, that required the intervention of Professor D.B. Devdhar, who was a former cricketer. He needed to intervene and ensure that the schools do not really stop playing cricket. But there have been plenty of instances such as this. So people have been very critical of Indians having continued playing cricket. So there are plenty allegations, criticisms, counter allegations. People say that if we have not really rejected the English language, why would we reject cricket? If we do not really reject the British Council or British food, British literature, why cricket should be kind of the scapegoat in this? So there's kind of no end to this debate. So we have to pick the cultural elements that we use our daily lives quite carefully, and we need to think about the provenance of all these cultural forms, where this really come from, and what do we get out of using it, and how do we actually use it? So if you are kind of an Indian living in Britain, one of the surefire conversational openers is that the kind of cricketers that you like. So that's a conversation that you cannot really have with the local person in the rest of Europe. So it gives you something to talk about, kind of build connections, kind of build networks with the wider Commonwealth world. Now, Commonwealth is not really as wide as it used to be, because starting with Britain, who joined the European Economic Council in 1972 and decided to withdraw from the Commonwealth to an extent, it's not really that important anymore. But this kind of gives you cultural connections and an ideological means of getting to know other people and immersing yourself in other cultures. So the main thing that we can highlight here is the emergence of transnational networks and connections, rather than something that is imperial or colonial or post-colonial, because these are all merely labels in the end.
Thank you, sir. We will take one last question from our YouTube. So it's asked by Anirban Dash. He's asking that Michel Foucault's analysis of disciplinary institutions suggests that power operates not just through coercion but through the internalization of surveillance and discipline. Can we interpret cricket as a panoptic institution where bodies are trained, disciplined, and normalized within a framework of colonial nationality? Does the idea of, in quote, gentleman's sport reinforce a Foucaultian regime of truth and prioritizes certain social behaviors while marginalizing indigenous and vernacular sporting traditions?
Oh, yes, absolutely. This is a very interesting framing of the Foucauldian idea of the panopticon, because when you are, suppose you are a cricketer, you are like playing as a team in front of a huge audience inside a stadium. And in this neoliberal times, even when you are not exactly in the stadium, you are always in the spotlight of fame and the circulation of information regarding what you do and how you do things. There is absolutely no escape from it. So sport is kind of an inverted panopticon for most people, because the audience... So Foucault talks about the context of the prison, in which there are a few prison guards who kind of watches over a large number of imprisoned populace. But in cricket and in most other sport, it's the other way around. It's a handful and a small number of cricketers and other athletes who are being surveilled by kind of a large infrastructure governing cricket, in which their every action is being dissected for meanings, and what exactly prompts them to do certain things. They're under scrutiny all the time of the press, of the audiences of those particular sports, also the governing body of the sport, not to speak of national and international organizations, including the nation's main government. So yes, sport is definitely it is an excellent example of a panopticon, in which bodies are regularly trained to conform to certain guidelines under which the sport is going to take place. One of the most important things about sport is that they need to follow certain parameters, so that the sporting performance, the sporting competition can be standardized. And there should be just one rule which needs to be followed by everybody. Now, we can talk about plenty of examples of deviant bodies and behaviors who do not really conform to this law. They have been sanctioned. Sometimes rules have been changed because these sorts of bodies were thought not to be deviant anymore. So social context plays a very important role in trying to implicate these sorts of ideologies of the body within sport. There has been kind of an ongoing conversation or dialogues regarding how trans people are going to be accommodated in sport, and that kind of brings us to the question, what is trans identity in all? So these things will need to be defined quite clearly. But the main thing about humanity in general is that it's fairly difficult to define almost anything. It just depends on where you are standing. And perspectives always are warped, and you kind of see the world in a way in which you would like to see this. So these sorts of the politics of visuality, what you like to hear, that's what you hear. And these sorts of things become terribly important when we talk about compliant bodies or compliant behavior in sport. So there have been like thousands of articles written on different aspects on how exactly these conforming rules are created, how they are reshaped or recalibrated to meet new guidelines of human behavior based on scientific research. Also, sociological research is quite important because it kind of gives you a window to look at people's mentality, how people think. For Indian cricket, I would say that the governing body is not terribly intrusive, unlike in many other sports. But yeah, there are plenty of things that we can consider when thinking about how the BCCI controls players. One of the recent examples after the fallout of the Australian tour was that the cricketers needed to use the same team bus. They would not be given like separate cars to travel to and from the stadium. Their wives would not be able to stay with them in the new hotel. So these are kind of behavioral norms that are being imposed on cricketers. And that gives you one of the ideas in which the Foucauldian ideas of disciplining and punishing to an extent for failing to perform well in an Australian tour works.
So, thank you, sir. So, thank you, sir, for joining us today. It's a wonderful session for discussion about cricket. So, once again, thank you, sir, for joining us and sharing your thoughts on your. And we hope for the best of your upcoming book that you're talking about. So, thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation to be here and the lovely interactions at the end of it. The book will take about 5 years to write, given the pace in which I work, but hopefully it will come out someday.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the conversations.
Thank you, sir.